Good morning, everybody. As has been introduced, I am Anele Mnyaka, um, husband to Palisa, who presented. You clap now, but I might be in trouble by the end of my presentation. And I felt a bit bad having been introduced as seasoned. I mean, looking at my crowd, but I'm quite privileged to be here, and I'm happy for you guys to give me the time of day and to explore what has been in my mind for the longest of times, and I love doing this part of my work, which is mapping, but also more than that. Teaching people or enlightening people on certain aspects of how we think about these things. I've been trained in the practice of urban design, and I found it, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And so when the opportunity came up to research Middleburg and to map it, I was like, you know what, this is the time. So I'm looking forward to this, and hopefully I can enlighten you on some things, or at least get you thinking. All right. So basically, my agenda here is to look at what spatial heritage is. I'm not going to be too long, hopefully, but also look at the tale of four maps. That's how I'm going to begin my presentation and breaking it down. And then the layers of Middleburg's spatial story, and also the spaces of memory and meaning. This is now going into looking at current settlement planning as well as towards a sustainable future. Now, it's going to be very broad and very high level. If you were a student job shadowing at my firm, I would take at least half the day to explain everything in detail and show you everything exhaustively. But I'm going to have to stay high level here, but hopefully you get the point. So let's get into it. Oh, by the way, I hail from the Bagwena Innovation Lab, which is an architectural and interior and also urban design firm. And that's relevant because they did come up in one of the maps around here. They were one of the influential groups in the area. So we have a very special interest. They went and formed they will come up later. I'll just highlight them when they come up. It's quite interesting, the history that we've gotten here today. But what is spatial heritage? I like the quote from Rosler, a geographer, who says, places remember what people forget. Um, and so this is why this is, to me, very close to my heart. So this is BIL, the Bagwena Innovation Laboratory, and we're specializing in urban design. I've joined the team to introduce urban design aspects, right? And basically what my mission is here is to enlighten people about these kind of things, to get us thinking differently. Because in my experience, we typically don't think, we work in silos, right? I come from a university, uni, singular, versity, which is diversity, right? We're supposed to be working together, but however, I've found that we work in silos. And as I've come to understand the work of engineers and historians and all of these people, I've come to understand that space is contested. Space is always contested. And so we're going to look at a brief history, but what spatial heritage is the study of spatial relationships and interactions in history, right? As it reflects on the current, and what we then, as a designer, what could we possibly do in moving forward into the future? And all the aspects must be respected, and everybody's voice must be heard and respected, no matter how contentious it gets sometimes, but we have to respect it. And I love that aspect of it, because that to me presents challenge and purpose, right? So space is what is natural. It is always contested, but place are now the meanings that people give to space, right? It is the place of memory and heritage, and this is where my passion lies, in creating places. Um, just a reminder of that wonderful quote. But I want to tell you about the tale of four maps. And I know the history doesn't begin and end with these maps, but I want to just give perspective, right? Because all of these have an influence on how people have thought about Middleburg, about South Africa and Middleburg as it relates in its context. Basically, it does not begin, but this map is very influential. The Berlin map of between 1884 and 1885. And what you see there is the ambition to conquer everything. However, with anything that tries to predict the future, you always run into things that you did not anticipate. So map number one is comes from the Berlin conference. That is going to have a very impactful influence on what happens around the 1900s, all right, toward in that period of the 1900s, because what the colonial map actually is that it carries the Boers, but also the British colony, right, and then the native tribes. I'm going to get into that very soon, but I just want to give you a point of reference for these kind of things. The colonial map then is focused on, for today's topic, on the Transvaal, and we've gotten that wonderful map from Mr. Duncan about that. You will see the Bakwena appear right over there. And this is why we took so much interest in this. I'm so excited about it. But basically, this is the map that was produced then of the Transvaal. The Transvaal then would from the perspective of now the natives around here, I've just given them a bit of color. You'll notice that the orange to beige are generally the Tswana speakers, the Tswana into Pedi speakers. That there in the middle, the red, is the area of potentially the most influence, and I think Mr. Duncan had highlighted this, where the Pedis, the Bapedi, had lived. Towards the eastern side is where you get the Nguni tribes with the Swati people, the Xhosas and the Zulus to the east coast, and you have the Ndebeles in between, and all the way up up towards Zimbabwe, you have the Vendas and the Tsongas, and they start to mix. But basically, this then would be the point of a lot of commotion around the 1800s. But basically, this would go on to produce now our third map, which sought to disregard everything that had happened, that Mr. Duncan had gone into detail about, disregard everything, and just say, listen, this is the Republic of South Africa, and every native will be pushed into these Bantustans. Now, from here, we would go on to this kind of map, which is what we should be most familiar with, is the current map of South Africa, right? And out of that, we have the province of Mpumalanga. In the province of Mpumalanga, we are in the area of Nkangala. Nkangala has a number of municipalities, but basically we are in the Steve Tshwete municipality, and there is Middelburg, right? From here, I want to then dive into the layers of Middelburg's spatial history. These are now the places of memory, right? And thank you to Mr. Duncan for that, for going into detail so that I can just summarize. Basically, to orientate you, this is from the perspective of Pretoria, looking out towards Mozambique, all right? There's Pretoria, you have Middelburg over there, and going on towards that. I am telling the story, don't worry, I will orientate you. But you have the Swati people towards the eastern coast, you have Mozambique, as well as Zimbabwe towards to your left, all right? This here is Pretoria right at the bottom, and we're looking up at the region between Pretoria and Lydenburg, which is Mashishining, and this is where Middelburg would then be formed as a midway point. But basically, it was all meant to link towards Delagoa Bay through a rail track beforehand, and then Middelburg would then be established. The Olifants River becomes a point of importance, as well as the Steelport River, because this then marks the territory of the Bapedi generally, right? I will not go into the detail, but these mountains become very, very important because geography matters when you're mapping spatial heritage, right? It speaks to the boundaries of people as well as the movements of people. This is very important because enter King Sekwati, who lived around 1820 to 1861. He is the lone survivor out of Tulare's sons, and he wanders around for 4 years. Oh, sorry. So the death of his father, of Sekwati's father, as well as an attack from the Matabele who were coming from the north, causes him to move to move further down south towards the Mahalis, it says. For a period of about 4 years, he's wandering in that area. But the Matebele have broken off an offshoot called the Nzunzandebele, which we've heard about. Quite fascinating. Tulare would then, with the tribe, would then go back to these mountains, and from there would he would pass away, and then Sekhukhune would succeed him. Sekhukhune is in contention with his brother Mapuru, but he ends up being the paramount chief, basically, and sets up a fort, which was his home around these mountains. Here, he would cause a lot of consternation for the colonial powers as well as the natives as well. These are my estimated boundaries of his kingdom and his establishment. I think it goes beyond this, but basically this is why. The reason why I say that is because he then begins to clash with the Boer. Mining has started in Leidenburg, but then he begins to clash with the Boers because he doesn't want to want them coming over the steel port rivier, right? Middelburg is founded in 1864. Leidenburg or Mashishining mining begins in 1873, and by 1876, the volunteer corps is formed. This volunteer corps is brutal in its ways, and basically Sekhukhune stands up as a blockade against them, not wanting them to cross over the river and into his kingdom. This would then culminate in Botshabelo 1877, where, in fact, in 1877, because the British have now annexed the Transvaal into the British Empire. However, 2 years later, Sekhukhune would be defeated by Sir Gurney Wolseley. Now, this is the force of the British Empire coming in to influence the region, right? He would then be captured, Sekhukhune would then be captured and sent for trial in Pretoria. This is an image of him and his family during the captivity. He would then go back and be released in 1882, where he is then months later murdered by his brother, or assassinated by his brother Mapuru. Mapuru then takes over, but he is on the run, right? Because after the defeat of Sekhukhune by Sir Gurney, the Matabele, who have now formed the Nzunza Ndebele, are now under Nyabele, right? We've heard about him, but basically he then accommodates Mapuru, right, as a refuge, running away from the colonial powers who want to capture and try Mapuru for the assassination of his brother. And basically, in the war that was detailed earlier, the commission meets in Middelburg in 1882, and the capture of Mapuru and Nyabela arrived because Nyabela refused to let Mapuru go, right? And basically, they are both captured and tried in Pretoria. But having said all of that, then, and I'm going to bring this back a bit later, I want to then just divert your attention to talking about spaces of memory and meaning. This is now the heritage and status quo of Middelburg as we have come to understand it. Right? So, bearing in mind the history of what just happened, my goal here is to talk about sustainable futures, right? But let's first look at the heritage and status quo of Middelburg. We begin, and I've just placed the old map, the original layout of the town, and the layout currently is quite faithful to it. It's a boundary of about 1.6 kilometers on the short side and 2.7 kilometers on the long side, and this has kept for years, right? And this was a division of the original farmland. But basically, what we then see, I don't think my clicker is working. Okay. The new boundary now in 2025 is much wider. 17 kilometers on the long side and about 8.4 kilometers on the short side, right? But basically what this speaks to is that in terms of how you can understand Middelburg is that you have the historical core, which still constitutes the CBD. You have your institutions. This is not the full sum total of the institutions, but just for your orientation and understanding. And also, you have the residential component that then complements this CBD, as well as the mining that starts to happen in brown, and the industrial in purple, right? You then have your heritage offering. right? Your current heritage offering, and I wasn't exhaustive here, but basically you have the cohort that is more central to the CBD that was established of the items that were buildings and institutions and stuff that were established in the 1800s, and then those that were established in the early 1900s or mid 1900s, which are of heritage significance now. And basically, this then leads me to current settlement planning. I gave you all that background to say that contestation of space still has an influence on how we make settlements now and how we engage with the space and where we find our sense of place. And what I mean here is that, could you please zoom out? There you go. So just to reorientate you, this is the CBD, and this is the original core. And what you will find there is that you now have the N11, which is a national route running through the town, creating connections for the neighboring places, as well as the provincial roads and the original network of the grid structure. This is now, if you remember, the grid is created for ox wagons and walking on foot. Right, the railways will then come and traverse the city, and the historical station would be there. But the point is that this is now city planning from a wagon and walking perspective. This is for meant to be reachable, right? So old people, I think, grown people, mature people, right? As well as well as people with walking challenges and stuff like that. This kind of system works well to accommodate everybody. However, the introduction of the vehicle, the motor vehicle, the car, then undermines this kind of planning, because what you'll find is that in the new urban areas, you have, and of course I'll put a historical marker there, just to reference us, Canon Cop, on the hill, and then what you'll find there is that, okay, you have your national roads. Remember, now cities and residential areas are not being designed for the human, for the man, but for the car, right? And they have to factor in accessibility. So what you'll find is that in suburban planning, you then have this network of roads. You have the core, the major trunk routes, but then you have your connector roads that connect the neighborhood, particularly to the CBD, which is the office and retail center. And then what you find is that there's a network then, an underlying network of streets. These are neighborhood streets, your front yard, basically. And there's multiple points of entry within these. The new settlement seems to be following in the same vein, but this generally has nothing to do with place making. This is just about you're accommodating the vehicle, and that's how we plan cities and areas where people live. That's Dennisig and that's Kenonkop. Then the next area will be Claville, Urarand, and Mineralia, right? And basically, for reference, you have your N11 going into town and your provincial routes cutting across, right? And those are just your areas. And there, what you'll find, this points out the same thing that this map, that the map of the previous map points out, where you have this logical system and network of how places are arranged, right, as it relates to the city. However, when you get then to the township establishment, and this is then now the legacy of apartheid planning. If you look at places in Johannesburg, for instance, such as Coronationville or Westbury, this is the kind of planning that they did when they did the forced removals, and the new structure then started to take a different shape. The original structure was a grid structure, right? And the importance of a grid is that you can see from across the street, all right? If there's danger, you can just change streets and you don't have to be diverted from where you're going, right? Or delayed too much. But here, in the townships, you find a different structure, and and this is the kind of planning, the kind of core road structure looks very, it has a lot of dead ends. So it's dead ends and cul-de-sacs, because the supporting road structure then has a lot of cul-de-sacs and dead ends as well. And this is the kind of thing that is perpetuated now by the new dispensation of planners and people who are mapping and people who are forming new settlements, because we are expanding, but we're still carrying on this kind of thing. And this creates a number of challenges. The new settlement is in the same vein as the older Nazareth and Rockdale, right? But what I want to get to is that you have the inevitability. If we keep creating spaces like this, we have the inevitability of informality. And what that means is that whatever system we are creating right now to be accommodated, it will be stretched beyond what it needs to be. Because at the end of the day, again, space is always contested for, right? So people always try to work with what their immediate surrounding is. Usually, there's no long-term vision, right? But we as planners and designers have to think about the long term. What you find fascinating about this is that you have your main house, which is your social housing, but then at the back you'll have all this informality happening, right? As well as these are kind of extensions, but this is all part of the informality because the original house would be at the center, which allowed for space for an accommodation at the back. What you'll see here is some research we did a couple of years ago in another township where the black is the main structure, but at the back you see all of this informality. So if this place here, just this block, was planned for 20 families, you find out there's 200 people living there or 500 people living there, right? They make it work, but it ends up looking like that, right? Because it's not a planned thing, it's a reactive thing, right? And you want people to be able to understand and orient themselves in their lived space, right? And so that is just one of the things that I wanted to point out to you. And then there were what is sometimes a point of contention. And it's very difficult to reconcile then to make that formal when it's that much informality, right? As a result, our current government for the past 30 years have just left the old townships and not touched them with the 1 meter foot stick because they don't want to mess with, right? With that kind of formation. It's quite difficult to unravel, but that's a challenge for me, right? As a designer to then reconcile this thing. So how I wanted to approach this now, when you look at history and you have translated into what's happening in the present and how we could possibly move forward into the future, it's always difficult to stick to one thing. And so there were many avenues which I could have explored, but I wanted to just bring a bank of ideas of how we could then resolve some of these issues, how we could think about resolving some of these issues, and how we now, in our enlightened minds, should be thinking about moving forward, right? And I wanted to draw from works that I had done in my career and the lessons learned, right? So I'm taking you through my learning journey practically now, away from theory of settlement making and good public and good spaces, right? So this is the Middleburg's heritage offering, right? And on top of that, I want to argue that when you have the offering, create a core, right? This is now latching on to what's already happening, right? You have your core, make it a precinct. What's there is that you already have your heritage aspect with the white church. You already have your square, Ruth Square. You have the hospital precinct happening around there, and as well as more heritage aspects. So you want to create a core around your most valuable spaces. And what you want to do with that is to then upgrade that into a visibly changed environment, right? So that people can begin to see the upliftment and the value, that this is the core, right? It has a sense of identity, right? And it must relate to all histories, right? Because one of the things about space or place is that when people don't put meaning to the place and they feel like it doesn't represent them, it creates a problem because they never feel like they belong. On top of that, when skin breaks, then they all want to go trash that place. Joburg, I've worked in a couple of projects in Joburg, historical projects, which it's an exercise in chest pains. It will just break your heart because the people have gone to trash these places, and when you engage with them as to why and trying to understand and do they buy into the vision, they don't feel like they belong. They don't feel like these spaces are theirs. But you create a precinct that shares that of shared identity because history is shared. Right? History is shared. And then what you can do then is connect the disparate parts, the connecting settlements, and what you begin to do, again, same language. But how do you go about doing this? As an urban designer, I have to think about these things, and we're on a timer. You basically begin with a template, right? How you deal with the public environment becomes very important. You have to create a template. For me, it gets very detailed because I have to design all of these things. But basically, what you want to do is to create clear and logical spaces. You use materiality to clearly delineate where people can walk, where people can sit. The lighting is quite important, especially in trade areas, because people want to trade for longer sometimes. And so you create clearly delineated spaces, but your materials have to be very robust. On top of that, you have to consider the environment, right? So you always add your soft landscaping. All of these things, remember, it's various spaces that are contested. Now you have to reconcile all of these things into one space where everybody wants. The taxi guys want to be there, the street traders want to be there, the youth want to be there, and all sorts of things are happening in that space. And so I believe there's this place for art in public spaces where, and it must represent various histories, right? Especially the history of the place, right? But because this expresses the character of the place, right? And on top of that, you have to then understand the public environment, how cities are structured. This is this is usually your basic block, urban block, or even township blocks. Some are wider, some are smaller. But what you want to be dealing with is, because space is always contested, you want to deal with transport, trade, walking areas for pedestrians, play areas for kids, sports, retail, residential. It can all get overwhelming. But the important thing is that when you understand that, okay, this is your working template, it's always live and it's always shifting and moving. You then add elements for place making, right? Where you clearly delineate those spaces. Now you know where the roadway is, versus before it was like this, and then you add your elements that clearly delineate the spaces, providing pedestrian safety, open walkways. This is now getting into the details of how we could possibly reconcile these spaces, right? And then you add your urban elements, the seating, your bins, your lights, your traffic lights, etc., your cross points, and then you add your soft elements, right? So I always have to try and get to these kind of things, because if you're walking and you're carrying plastic bags from from Checkers and you're walking across to there, you might want to put your bags down because your fingers are getting chopped, right? And then, or you might want some shade on a sunny day to be protected from the elements. But these are the kind of things that I need to think about. So how have I been engaging with this kind of thing? When you think about public transport, it's not just a place for transport, right? I think Zaha Hadid, architect lady, had said, a building is not just a building, right? It's a place, all right? A place for memory, and for activity and for function and for all kinds of things. But what you think about here is that you can even be bold. And this is a bold approach, right? Because you clearly delineate where pedestrians need to walk. You clearly define where the spaces are, where trading should happen, where taxi holdings are, where the taxi is, where the taxi operations go, long distance, short distance, all of that. You resolve all of that, and then you can even add place-making things such as public artworks as you seek to reconcile. This is now Middleburg, and this is where the current taxi station is. On top of this, this is the kind of product that you're looking for. For me, it gets detailed where I have to resolve the contested space, right? And I have to place everybody where it is natural for them to be, but it can be an opportunity to make places. There it is again, where you have your taxi holdings. It doesn't have to look bad as it typically does, but what you have there is where your people can walk, where people can sit and have a conversation, or they're waiting for their taxis. You have your lighting over there for safety, for walking at night. On top of this, then you have to understand what you could possibly do with your traders, right? Because they're also in the urban space. So you look at what their needs are, right? How they currently operate, and you could provide a more solid and aesthetic even structure that is compliant, can be approved, etc. But you start to think logically about the kind of spaces that you can. And you can see there is a spill out onto the sidewalk, but that is not necessarily entirely compromised because you still have space to walk around, and the people are feeling protected and safe. So there's elements of safety, there's elements of aesthetics, there's elements of functionality, right? And these are the kind of things you always want to think about. But different traders have different needs, and they don't always need a room, a house, a shelter. They can also be housed in open air stores, for instance. And And it doesn't always look as elegant as this, in that it can also look a bit messy, which is fine because it can easily, because it's a logical system, it can easily be cleaned, be aesthetic and all of that. So it maintains its integrity, but the sense of identity now and dignity for people is what you've provided there without compromising city placemaking, right? So what do you do with again, I'll take you back to your heritage offering where you've created a core. And I would argue you want to think about the idea of shared streets, right? That does not compromise for the vehicle, but also that accommodates the vehicle, but also accommodates people, right? And we want spaces like this in South Africa. This is Hermana, so we know it can be done and can be maintained and can last. And I would argue that a place like Middelburg would be the perfect place to do such a thing. And this is how they are development planners within the city can start to think about these things. In terms of how to connect the neighborhoods, street treatment, and all of these kind of things, how do you treat the street, right? And does it carry the same identity with the picture that I showed you before? Does it carry the same identity in various parts of the city, right? So as you move towards the townships, it can carry the same identity again. We're getting back to the fact that the history is shared. Therefore, our thinking about the future is how we can share the space, right? Otherwise, we're creating a challenge for our time, similar to how Sekukune had to fight, had a big challenge in his time to keep people out of his territory, similar to how Nyambele had to do the same thing. We don't want to create a challenge for our time unnecessarily, whereas we could accommodate everybody by creating and giving them a similar sense of identity, right? We can carry our own ethnicities, but in terms of the language of our spaces, right, of our places of memory and meaning, we can then start to look at how these how to reconcile those disparate parts, which means oh, sorry, and also how you deal with your open spaces as well. You have to get a bit inventive because sometimes it doesn't work out the way you think it's going to work out in practicality and reality, but it can still be achieved. And this is quite a busy park in Hillbrow, for instance, but it still works through just innovative design and identifying what people want. This is how to deal with your open spaces, basically. Now, getting back to this to township planning and how we do it, right? I believe that there's still some redemption for these kind of designs. Not that we should carry them on in the future, right? But I believe that in terms of the structure of these places, but in terms of what we have currently, I believe we can still reconcile. So how you deal with your high street, which is usually your the darker, thicker lines over here, and what happens at the front here is that you begin to see a bit of trade happening, right? But how do you treat that, and how do you engage with that as a city, right? Because you don't want even tourists to have places they can't go to, right? We want an inclusive city. And we want locals to be able to engage with people as well, and to have that element of safety. And so this is how you could possibly treat the high street, but also the neighborhoods now, in terms of dealing with the neighborhood sidewalk. What are the needs? Transport needs. And so you put lay-bys, right? You put bins, because it's usually illegal dumping. You put bins, you put green areas, you put lighting, you put some trees, and clear and clean walkways, right? Street frontage is very, very important in those kind of areas because they're such, as I showed you, the density is so much that people need breathing space, right? And which suffocates them. Then when they come to the suburban areas or the urban areas, then they feel like they can breathe a little bit more, right? But then they linger longer and they end up loitering and things start happening, right? The point is, you can begin to tinker with the existing environment to reconcile it, such as dealing with sports. When we did this kind of project, the Jabulani Sports Complex, it was quite amazing because 2 years later, 3 years later, the people were so protective of it because it was their thing. Because we took a place that they had identified as a soccer field, it was informal, and then we upgraded it and we put a program there, and suddenly people are protecting it. They don't want it was not touched. The grass is always cut, and people are always around on the street and interacting, and it's quite amazing actually. But it's one of those things, and this is in the same area where now you begin to deal with universal accessibility. The people with prams, people, older people that need to be using the spaces, right? And so you create universally accessible spaces. You put things like bollards, for instance. This is now getting to the practicalities of how space is used, right? You put things like bollards to stop cars from riding onto and encroaching, because cars are always encroaching onto pedestrian spaces, right? But basically, I would hope that with all this being said, we are starting to think about how we could possibly reconcile and a different vision for the future, right? I think our ancestors, they had some foresight, but as I showed in the very first map, there's some things that you cannot see. I don't think the British at the time had foreseen the truck boers establishing themselves and actually making it work in those times. As a result, a clash happened for over space and territory, right? And I believe that we don't want to create similar things unintentionally, right, in our time. And I think we have a responsibility for the future, because what the history that they carry, we are now the history of other people, right? And so I believe that gives us a sense of purpose that should unite us. And this is how we could begin to think about unlocking all of these blockages and frustrations that we seem to have with each other. Having said all of that, I thank you on going on this journey with me for mapping memory, heritage, and considering a sustainable future. Thank you.